Bill Gross summed it up best. Mainstream America is slowly being cooked alive. And people who aren't prepared for that aren't going to make it.
Hey friends, welcome back. I have a very exciting and informative call ready for you here with Dave Kranzler from Investment Research Dynamics. Dave's on the line right now. Dave, how are you, sir?
I'm well, thank you. Thanks for having me on again.
Hey, it's a real pleasure, man. We always love to have you on because, you're a straight shooter and, we're following your blog. So many people are now over at investmentresearchdynamics.com. I want to talk about your most recent article, The World is in Trouble. Are you prepared for the road? Which, of course, is a reference to Cormac McCarthy's heartbreaking novel and the movie, of course, that came from it, starring Viggo Mortensen. And the book is called The Road. Boy, I tell you what, I don't want to be on that road ever, my friend, because that's a bleak existence. But before we talk about that, could we circle back to your September 20th article, Is Silver Intentionally Being Drained and Diverted from the Retail System? It's important that we talk about it, and before I steal any of your thunder from this article, where would you like to begin?
Well, I guess in terms of, you can steal whatever thunder you want from this article. I prefaced it with the qualifier that for me this is just, it's a theory that I've been toying with, and I wanted to put it out there to see how the response would be.
Yeah, well, let me read this then, because I do want to steal a little bit of your thunder then.
Steal it all if you need to. That's fine.
No, I read the whole thing, and I think it's a well thought out thesis here. And but you and I just in the pre-call started talking a little bit about the criminality in the system and the fact that when the collapse comes, it could be far, far worse than anybody even believes is possible. And again, it gets us back to the road, which is a place and a paradigm nobody will want to live in. But you wrote in this article, since it became clear to me in 2001 that the U.S. population was under attack by the wealthy, power-hungry elitists who have gained control of the system, I've been able to see how the economic, financial, and political collapse of the United States was going to unfold with a fair amount of clarity by applying this think like a criminal algorithm. What would I do next if I were a criminal that could operate unshackled from rule of law, end quote. And I love that paragraph because the way you set it up is so exactly true to those of us who are awake. We know that the criminals are in charge. We know that Rumsfeld said in 2001, the day before 9/11, $2.3 trillion, Dave, was missing from the Pentagon. Now the Pentagon openly admits they can't account for $8.5 trillion. So clearly the looting is on, and it would make only sense now that silver and gold is being looted too. They've taken everything else. Now it's time to loot the physical metal. So I just wanted to mention that before we talk about this, because again, your article, Is Silver Intentionally Being Drained and Diverted from the Retail System? Let's talk about that.
My first idea when I started thinking about this was I looked at, this retail silver shortage has developed in the United States, and it's not just the United States, it's global. I mean, I get emails and comments on my blog from readers all over the world, or in sort of the main venues around the world, Australia, Hong Kong, UK, etc., Germany, who are describing similar experiences in their country in terms of inability to get silver now, or you have to pay high premiums for it. And immediately when some of these apologists for the bullion banks like Bron Suchecki come out and they start poo-pooing this idea that there's a shortage of silver, because they say, well, look at the inventory on the COMEX. There's not a wholesale shortage. Well, yeah, let's take a look at the inventory on the COMEX, Bron. Why don't you go and visit the vaults with an independent auditor, and let's see what's really inside the vaults, and also let's inspect all of the files associated with the silver that's in those vaults so we can see what's been hypothecated and leased out. Because the fact of the matter is, the bullion banks who operate the COMEX are the ones who prepare those reports.
Mm-hmm. And equip them with a disclaimer that says, nothing you've read here, nothing that we've said can really be construed as fact, so proceed at your own risk.
Well, the CME slapped that on in I think it was June of 2013 is when it showed up. Mm-hmm. And so I think what the people who operate the CME, which is the governing body above the COMEX, I think they basically said, whoa, wait a minute here. We're not really sure what's really there, so we better put this legal disclaimer. And believe me, the lawyers made them do that, and because they know something's wrong. And the truth is, if those reports are honest and bona fide, it would be the only financial reporting in any area of any of these banks that is free from corruption and fraud and
Right.
fraudulent reporting. Because these banks have all been, successfully accused and prosecuted of fraudulent reporting and criminality in almost every other segment of their businesses.
No, that's right. MERS fraud, LIBOR scandals, drug running for cartels, money laundering. Absolutely, you're 100% right.
Yep. And so they want us to, guys like, the people at the Perth Mint want us to believe that the one small report that doesn't really get heavily scrutinized outside of our little small sector of the world, that they're actually reporting that honestly? Come on. So what I started thinking about is, we know that China and India are hoovering gold. They're buying they're both on pace to import a record amount of gold this year. And we also know, we suspect, you can't prove it because the data simply isn't there, but both India and Hong Kong have massive solar programs that require a massive amount of silver. And Rory Hall and I interviewed a guy who lives in Beijing, and he came up with some kind of arcane import data that shows that Hong Kong's been, or not Hong Kong, that China's been importing. You can track that they've been importing silver concentrates, sort of concentrated forms of silver that's highly unrefined. But you can't get any information in terms of, actual physical silver bars that they're likely importing. And the reason why we think they're importing a lot is because, according to this guy, and he's got all the data to prove it from actual Chinese reports, it's in our interview, China is essentially using all of the silver that it produces internally from its mines to fuel its solar installation program. And a very similar program is in place in India. And we know that India has been importing by far a record amount of silver this year. In fact, the U.S. is exporting silver to India, for God's sakes. I mean, there's a shortage of silver at the mint in this country, which some of these bullion bank apologists are blaming on production bottlenecks. But that's BS as well. And yet we're exporting silver to India. So it kind of occurred to me, all right, if I'm a criminal and I know I've got a silver shortage problem, a supply problem in terms of supplying silver to big, wealthy buyers and sovereign buyers like India and China, and make no mistake, I'm sure the Gulf state countries are importing a massive amount of silver as well. You don't really care whether or not the U.S. hoi polloi have access, can readily buy silver. It doesn't bother you if they can't, and no one cares whether they can or they can't. And so why not divert a lot of the silver that might otherwise or should be going to the mint to produce enough silver to supply the demand at the retail level? You need that silver to deliver into India and China, et cetera, because it's one thing if you can't deliver to the U.S. middle class, but it's another thing if you default on delivery to sovereign buyers. That's when the gig is up.
That's right. You wrote in your article, the attitude towards the American populace at this point would be, let them eat cake. Because the U.S. Mint is required by law to produce enough silver to meet demand, and yet they're restricting the flow of silver. They're rationing silver eagles because you speculate that they're trying to stem the tide somewhere else. So, is it India? Is it China? But then you go on in your article to actually come up with another thesis, which is, maybe because they want to move us to a cashless society, maybe the best way to implement that and prevent any black market trading in silver, which is really the common man's metal, right? The poor man's gold. Let's get all of the silver off the market as quickly as possible. So that's an interesting thesis as well. I tend to think the first thesis is more correct, that, big buyers, deep-pocketed people that are tired of the fiat dollar and can see the paradigm coming to an end, want silver and gold in physical form. That's what I think is going on. But your second thesis is interesting as well.
Well, I think the second part of the thesis, or the second thesis, I don't think the two exist on a standalone basis. I think the second part of it would be a collateral benefit for them.
Right.
But you're right, and that's why I put the first thesis first. I think that's what's going on, right now, and it's an immediate need for the silver. But then they say, oh, well, guess what? We'll kill two birds with one stone because we're going to move to a digital currency, and we don't want a very large percentage of the population to own gold and silver because otherwise it'll make it harder to impose our will and a digital system on the entire population because a black market currency market will develop and an underground economy will develop based on the use of precious metals.
Right. Well, before we talk about the collapse and getting back to the world is in trouble in this the road metaphor, the Cormac McCarthy novel.
Just real quickly, and I had one more point about the second part of that, or the second thesis, and that is if they can drain the metal from the retail system and limit the access or the accessibility of gold and silver to the public, then they don't have to confiscate metal. I mean, I think it would be a really bad thing if they all of a sudden tried to confiscate metal or decree it to be illegal, because then in that instant, everyone in this country would know that everything that the gold investing community is saying is true. The conspiracy theories aren't theories; they're true.
Right.
So this is, in a way, it's kind of a backdoor way of confiscating the metal. They're just not overtly doing it and decreeing that you can't use metal. They just make it unavailable. Do you see what I'm saying?
Yeah, no, I do see what you're saying. And what makes me wonder about, the bigger picture is what is going on at the very, very top levels? Because you probably recall the Economist magazine from 1988. On the cover was a phoenix rising from a burning pile of paper dollars. And around the phoenix's neck was a medallion, a gold coin that said 2018. And the cover said, "Get ready for a world currency." So the Rothschilds own the Economist magazine. So this has been a plan in the making for a very, very long time. I think, 30 years? 88, 98, yeah.
It's almost 30 years.
Yeah, and I don't know that they need to confiscate metal because they know so few people have it. The common man has no precious metal, and those that do, even the people that we know, we're not talking about tons and tons of metal like the world's richest guys. I mean, look at the Rothschild vaults. I don't want to get off track here, Dave, but I just wonder what the plan really is, because if that appeared on the Economist magazine in 1988, we've only got a couple years left of this paradigm. I mean, we all talk about collapse, but I think that's a very important landmark historical fact that needs to be cited. The Economist magazine, 1988. Get ready for a world currency in 2018. So maybe they don't have to confiscate metal because they know the majority of the public has none.
I think that's right, but I think that this New World Order plan is a Western plan. I'm not sure that they're getting the cooperation that they need from China and Russia, and it could be that was something that they didn't anticipate way back in 1988. I mean, way back in 1988, Russia was essentially on its ass, and I mean, China was nowhere. I mean, China wasn't even a popular tourist destination per se back then. I mean, some people were going over there to get cheap suits, people that I knew in New York, but China was nowhere. They weren't even on the map. So I'm not a buyer of this idea that China and Russia are ultimately in on the gig and everything we're seeing is kabuki theater. I think that the reason why this is going to head to a nuclear war, and I was chatting with Dr. Paul Craig Roberts yesterday, and he just bluntly says the U.S. wants to start a nuclear war with Russia because they think on a first strike basis they can win it. And he said the people running the Pentagon are insane. And I think he's right. And I think the reason why we're seeing these geopolitical tensions, I mean, the U.S. is at odds with China in the South Seas, and China continues a massive military buildup there, and they're obviously at odds with Russia in several spots around the world. So I think, and Dr. Roberts said this yesterday, he said, Russia refuses to be one of the United States' vassals. Mm-hmm. And I think that's what it would take in order for this New World Order plan to really be set in motion. And that's why I think ultimately this thing is headed for a global military catastrophe.
Yeah. No, I worry about that too. I don't think China is anywhere near a proxy state or a vassal state to the degree Japan is. I mean, the Pentagon and the powers that be in this country and the bankers control Japan, and I don't believe they control China in the same way. And I do wonder about Rothschild power, if we could just circle back to that for 1 second before we talk about World War III. Again, that Rothschild Economist magazine, 1988. I posted a piece over at SGT Report that I wrote called "The Aristocrats, the Rothschilds." And if I could just read this to you, Dave, I'd love to get your thoughts on it because I thought it was very ironic. The first 5 minutes of a documentary produced by Channel 4 in the UK, a very, very slick propagandist piece about the Rothschild family, actually produced by daughter Rothschild. Her name is Hannah Rothschild. The first 5 minutes alone are worth every second of your time. In the first few minutes, you will find the following sentence, quote, "Far away from public view, the famously discreet billionaire is hosting a private party to celebrate an art world coup. In 2007, he paid £5 million for Jean Chardin's subtle masterpiece, Boy with a House of Cards." And then I wrote, "My friends, the actual name of the Chardin painting is Boy Building a House of Cards. And if you're fully awake, you must find such information about one of the world's richest bankers very telling and amusing. Jacob Rothschild bought that painting just 1 year prior to the 2008 economic collapse." And I go on to talk about so many other interesting pieces of propaganda in that movie. But don't you find that fascinating, Dave? He bought a painting in 2007 called Boy Building a House of Cards.
It's very, very interesting, and certainly the Brits are into their symbolism even more than Americans. My feeling is that even in the history of England, I mean, the monarchies would only last for a few hundred years, and they get replaced or overthrown or whatever. And so the Rothschilds, if you want to just sort of say they're the de facto royal family over there, mm-hmm. the behind-the-scenes royal family, mm-hmm. And they've been really sort of in power for maybe since the late 1700s or something. So it's been 4 or 5 generations,
right?
Something like that.
Yep.
And so maybe they're losing control. I mean, I've always believed that eventually dynastic families, etc., dynastic emperors, I think they get self-consumed with hubris, and that's their Achilles heel.
Well, that's true, except for in this case, if we go back to the Balfour Declaration and the founding of Israel, these people control a lot of territory on planet Earth. And at 4:38, 4 minutes and 38 seconds into this propagandist documentary, there's this absolute gem. Listen to this. "His guests at Waddleson are not confined to the nobility and the newly rich. Royalty and presidents also come here, each time planting a tree in commemoration, their spades left gleaming in the corridor leading to the visitors' lavatories." Honestly, that was actually the voiceover written in this thing. And I wrote, "How priceless. The shovels that kings, queens, and presidents used to dig holes on the Rothschild estate are left on display in the hallway leading to the visitor toilets." Are you starting to get the picture? So, I mean, honestly, and then it goes on to talk about the whole idea of the propaganda of this piece is that they're outsiders. They've always been outsiders, and it goes back to them being Jews, and they were never aristocrats because they're outsiders as Jews. And then Jacob Rothschild goes on to lament about the past family history and how they were victimized in the ghettos. And I thought to myself, Dave, when is the last time you had a conversation with somebody in which you created some sort of sense of woe is me based on how your family had to live 200 years ago? When is the last time you brought up the Kranzler family history from 150 years ago and how you were so victimized and the world should still sympathize with you today? It's absolutely absurd. And then, of course, they try to sell this off as you watch him buy these 5 and 10 million pound paintings and build new buildings in which to house them. They try to leave you with the impression that he's only worth 550 million pounds. It's utterly laughable. So I don't want to get too off track there, but I just think that the propaganda that we're being absolutely beat about the head with from all sides in the Mockingbird media is just astounding. And I don't think that the sheeple see it coming, man. When this collapse comes, when we hit that Cormac McCarthy, the road paradigm, the sheeple are going to wonder what the heck happened because they don't see it coming.
Oh, the middle class is and I said this a long time ago. I mean, I want to say like around 2004, it was before blogging was popular, and I used to submit a lot of material to, well, I still do, to La Metropole Cafe's nightly Midas report, and I just said, the middle class has a massive 2x4 being swung at the back of their head, and by the time they see it coming, it's going to be too late to duck.
Yeah, that's right. Can I play this soundbite for you? I mentioned it before we started the call. You haven't heard
Sure.
it yet. I want to play this for you. This comes from a YouTube channel called Pockets of the Future. This guy did a video called How Do I Figure Out What's a Hoax and What Isn't? And in this video, he talks about those who are awake versus those who aren't awake and how everyone's going to deal with the collapse. Listen to this.
So the people who live in this American system, believing in the American dream and thinking this is the greatest country in the world, buying into all of the hype, they are going to struggle greatly when everything collapses around them, because it's going to be impossible for them to make sense of what's going on. They're just going to look at everything as being completely unfair. And part of the problem with our system is the powers that be have created the illusion that they can control everything and take care of everything, and the system will last forever. I've talked about this in previous videos. It is a very difficult thing to overcome.
Okay, so I think the point there is that the collapse is coming, right? The dollar paradigm, the petrodollar world reserve currency paradigm is in the process of collapsing. The sheeple are unaware of it, and when it happens, they are going to have even a harder time dealing with the collapse than those of us who know what's coming, because at least we're mentally prepared.
Well, I think people who see it coming are and again, I want to qualify this by saying I've said for over a decade I can sit down and talk to someone about how to get prepared for what's coming, to prepare them to possibly see what the other side is going to look like when it does hit. But you got to ask yourself if you want to really be around to see what the other side looks like. I haven't decided whether I want to be around to see what that looks like, because every year that this drags on, I have a foreboding sense that the other side is going to be really bad, and every year they extend the pain and kick the can down the road, it's going to be offset equally by how bad it'll be on the other side.
Well, let's talk about that. You wrote on Wednesday, "The world is in trouble. Are you prepared for the road?" Of course, talking about Cormac McCarthy's novel, The Road. You mentioned that when you talked to Dr. Paul Craig Roberts the other day, he said that the people in the Pentagon are insane. And I don't think anything more true has ever been said, man, because the U.S. is stationing nuclear weapons now in Germany against Russia. I mean, it's madness. We're closer probably to thermonuclear war than we've ever been. And is that Paul Craig Roberts' take?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Because it's in the U.S. military doctrine now. It's the Wolfowitz doctrine. Part of that is that the U.S. can win a nuclear war against Russia if we hit them first. It's first strike doctrine, and it's in writing. It's there, and it's that doctrine was formed during the late stages of the Reagan administration. Reagan, you can Google this. I'm sure it's on the internet. Reagan referred to these people as the crazies in the basement, and it was a policy think tank that was part of the White House that basically came up with this plan where the U.S. needed to systematically get control of all the energy resources in the Middle East, etc. Well, those guys were Paul Wolfowitz, Donald Rumsfeld, Dick Cheney. Those were the guys that were the crazies in the basement. Well, guess what? Fast forward to 2000, and all of a sudden those people have key positions in George W. Bush's cabinet.
Yeah, well, that's right. And Rumsfeld and Cheney together in the Reagan administration, Paul Craig Roberts would know this well, they came up with the continuity of government plans, which were kept secret, and were rolled out, I believe, on 9/11. And, Dick Cheney and Donald Rumsfeld are two demons, and Paul Wolfowitz is right up there with them. And
pure evil.
Pure evil, man, in this neocon agenda to take the world to the very brink of thermonuclear war. is pure madness, because now the whole world can see the fraud that is the war on terror. We can see that now in Syria, as Putin says, oh, you guys want to fight ISIS? Well, we'll come and help you. We'll fight ISIS. But of course, that's not what the Pentagon wants. The Pentagon wants to make it look like we're fighting ISIS as we fund and help ISIS topple Assad. I mean, the whole sham has been exposed.
That's right, and I told people, I don't remember if I put it on my blog or not, but I mean, it was a brilliant move by Putin. When I saw his response to that, oh yeah, you're right, we do need to fight ISIS. We're going to move our military into the town where Assad lives and rules Syria from. And I saw that and I just laughed. And then my thought was, Putin was probably thinking to himself, okay, Obama, your move. Well, guess what Obama's move was? Move 20 nuclear bombs into Germany. Mm-hmm. And it goes against the non-proliferation nuclear treaty that was signed, I don't even know what year, but there was a treaty signed globally to not proliferate nuclear weapons. Well, guess what? We're moving 20 nuclear bombs into Germany. Each bomb is 4 times more powerful than the bomb that hit Hiroshima.
It's absolute madness. And we saw what happened in Tianjin, China, right? That event, that explosion that is really yet to be adequately explained.
There's been several since then.
Yeah, but that was the biggest, most devastating thing I've ever seen, really, aside from a nuclear explosion. And I know there's been big explosions at chemical plants, in Texas, and I get all that. But look at the crater, and it filled with water, and look at the evidence of kinetic weapons from space having been used. Mike Adams at Natural News reported on that. I initially thought it was probably some sort of suitcase or micro nuke. But I'll tell you what, this escalation of World War III is now taking place in very quantifiable, very tangible, very horrifically frightening ways, Dave. And, I'm with Paul Craig Roberts. There are madmen running the show in this country. And unless the American people stand up or the military itself stands up to get rid of them, I'm not sure that this is going to end well.
Well, again, I kind of came to that conclusion quite some time ago that this was eventually headed for war. I mean, that's what history tells us. When an empire nation's economy is collapsing and there's nothing they can do about it, and when their global empire is collapsing and there's nothing they can do about it, what do? When all else fails, start a war. And that's been the lesson that we've learned throughout history. And I don't know why people think it's going to be different this time, because it's never been different throughout history, and we've got 5,000-6,000 years of it chronicled. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So I mean, if it is different this time, it would be an extreme statistical outlier. Mm-hmm. I guess you'd call it a white swan, not a white swan, a green swan.
Well, the other thing, too, that can help us understand what's going on is just to step back and take a look at history, and everybody should be aware of Albert Pike's 1871 plan for the 3 world wars. Read about that, because it's very, very scary stuff, and it's all part of the plan, unfortunately, I think. It's all part of a Luciferian plan, if I may go there, because Albert Pike did. They want to bring out the true light through the universal manifestation of the pure doctrine of Lucifer, brought finally out into the public view. This will be after World War III. So these people are truly insane. And at the end of the day, getting back to Cormac McCarthy's novel The Road, and my God, did that movie just move my spirit, man. I have kids. Can you imagine being in a world like that, a post-apocalyptic world where cannibals are running wild because there's no food? That is not a world anyone wants to live in. And it kind of seems like that's the world they're taking us toward.
Well, it's interesting because, again, I haven't seen the movie, because if you really like a book, the movies always ruin it for you. But from what I've heard about the movie, it's slightly different than the book, and the outcome, I think, I guess the way it ends, it has a spark of optimism in it. But the book is I mean, it's pure apocalyptic. And it starts out, it's just the man and his boy, walking. They're trying to get presumably from the north to the south to where there's warm weather, and you don't really know what has happened. I mean, based on the visual descriptions that the author provides throughout the book, you assume that it was some sort of nuclear apocalypse. Mm-hmm. But he never says, and he never comes out and says, oh, this was caused by nuclear weapons. I mean, you're enshrouded in darkness in the book. And unfortunately, Cormac McCarthy will never grant media interviews, and so no one really knows what his intent was. But I read the book, I believe it was 2008 or 2009, I forget, not too long after it came out. And I was just like, you know what, this is his vision of where this is headed. And the thing is, when I started getting into the precious metals and doing all the related reading that, leads you into, the truth about what's really going on and into the quest for truth seeking, I had thought that everything was going to collapse by 2008, and it did. We had a de facto systemic collapse in 2008. The only thing that didn't accompany it was a political collapse. But we were close to that as well. And they saved it by obviously printing tons of money, creating more derivatives, and basically stealing a few trillion of taxpayer money and giving it to the banks. I mean, that's basically what kept the system from collapsing back then. And everyone looked at it like, oh, geez, these guys did a great job saving the system. Well, guess what? All they did was kick the can down the road and make it worse, because all the problems that caused what happened in 2008 continued to fester and get worse. And it's been hidden underneath a well-crafted shroud of propaganda. I mean, I don't think the average citizen in this country really understands that the derivatives problem is several magnitudes bigger than it was in 2008. It's just been hidden by changes in accounting rules, etc. And the debt problem has continued to grow every year. I mean, for instance, in terms of the propaganda, the public belief is that we ran a budget deficit of about $500 billion in 2014, in the fiscal 2014. Well, then how do you explain the fact that the Treasury debt outstanding went up by a little over $1 trillion in fiscal 2014? It's because they're hiding their expenses and they take them off the books, etc. But the fact of the matter is the deficits continue to spiral up. And one of the things that they've done in order to help contain the growth in the budget deficit is they've been able to manipulate interest rates down so low. Well, guess what? The way they've done that is by piling on trillions and tens of trillions of more interest rate derivatives. And I would suggest that the reason that the Fed didn't raise rates last week is because even a small incremental rise in short-term rates is going to create the possibility of triggering a collapse of those interest rate derivatives, and that's when it's all she wrote. And that'll be a literal financial nuclear explosion that'll make Fukushima look like a day at the beach.
Yeah, and as you're talking, I'm recalling Representative Konjorsky's admission on C-SPAN after 2008. I think it was in February of 2009. He says, and it's shocking. He describes what was going on in 2008 at the height of the collapse. Listen to this.
On Thursday at about 11 o'clock in the morning, the Federal Reserve noticed a tremendous drawdown of money market accounts in the United States to the tune of $550 billion was being drawn out in a matter of an hour or two. The Treasury opened up its window to help. They pumped $105 billion in the system and quickly realized that they could not stem the tide. We were having an electronic run on the banks. They decided to close the operation, close down the money accounts, and announce a guarantee of $250,000 per account so there wouldn't be further panic out there. And that's what actually happened. If they had not done that, their estimation was that by 2 o'clock that afternoon, $5.5 trillion would have been drawn out of the money market system of the United States. $5.5 trillion would have been drawn out of the money market system of the United States, would have collapsed the entire economy of the United States, and within 24 hours the world economy would have collapsed.
Now, for those who've never heard that has to shock you to your core. $550 billion disappeared in an electronic run on the banks in the blink of an eye, Dave. And so when you say that we actually suffered a collapse in 2008, but they were able to just plug the hole? That's 100% true. There was an electronic run on the banks that was going to bring every nation, especially this one, to its knees. And somehow they were able to plug the hole. What I've always found fascinating, though, about that testimony from Kanjorski is the fact that, do we think for a minute they can't tell us who was responsible and who was draining all that money electronically? It's going somewhere, so where was it going? It wasn't mom and pops. It wasn't like thousands and thousands of different account holders. It was probably, it could have been the Rothschild cartel. My point is that we're never told that part of the story. You know, who was behind the electronic run on the banks in which $550 billion was drained in a matter of minutes? I mean, think about it.
It was definitely the elitists.
Yeah. So my point is,
Whether
and
it
your
was the
point,
Rothschilds or not, you know, it was probably Henry Paulson and his ilk.
yeah, it could have been Goldman, it could have been anybody, but the point is that if we know that happened in 2008, and we know it can and probably will happen again, that leads us directly down Cormac McCarthy's economic road of destruction. Sans nuclear weapons, sans Armageddon, an economic Armageddon is coming for the American people. And why don't we just summarize and finish up the call talking about that? What is your vision for the road? How bad is it going to get?
Well, again, it kind of just depends on to what degree the whole everything melts down. And again, I think it's going to be impossible to avoid a nuclear war, but let's say in the best case that somehow war is avoided and you just have a massive global financial, economic, and political reset. I mean, apparently Bill Gross summed it up best. Mainstream America is slowly being cooked alive.
Yeah.
And people who aren't prepared for that aren't going to make it. And obviously your audience, they've been preparing for this and they know what they need to do. Mm-hmm. And I don't think you're going to be able to feed your family unless you have a nice supply of, well, first of all, you're going to need a supply of food and water just to get through the first several months. And that's something Jim Sinclair has been saying for more than 10 years. Because the systems will shut down and it's not like you're going to be able to go to Costco and stock up.
Right. Yeah.
And then you're also going to need to have fungible amounts of gold and silver. I mean, you use gold to store larger chunks of wealth, and you use silver as fungibility so that you can, if you don't have food but your neighbor has something, you have some food, and he wants silver, you can trade silver for food, that type of thing. I mean, everyone knows that drill who's listening to this.
Yeah.
So, but the alternative view is global nuclear war, and then you get what was laid out in the road, if humanity survives it, which I'm sure there will be some. But there was a scene in the book, and apparently this wasn't in the movie, and this is what really kind of, when I first read it, I had to read the scene over and over, because the first time I read it, I was just shocked. So the boy and the man come across a survival bunker, and for some reason I had the impression it was somewhere in kind of, like Kentucky, somewhere around there, just based on the description of where they had been mm-hmm. and how they were traveling. Mm-hmm. And they find this survival bunker that was on an abandoned farm. They go into the farmhouse. It's been cleaned out already by other scavengers and groups of cannibals. Mm-hmm. And they find this underground bunker, and they lift it up. And when they come across these survival bunkers, they go in there and they look for canned food, propane, and bullets. Mm-hmm. That's what they need to survive. Mm-hmm. And they walk underground into this thing, and the novelist McCarthy describes, he walks into like this area that's like a kitchen, and the father reaches up, opens up a cabinet, pulls down this big can, and he looks inside the can, and it's full of 1-ounce Cougarans. And he picks one out, looks at it, puts it back in the can, and puts the can back up on the shelf. Mm. And then he goes and he scouts around for food, propane, and bullets, of which he finds all 3 in there. Mm-hmm.
That's interesting. No, I don't think that was in the movie, because I thought you were going to say they open up the the cellar door as they're exploring for food, and they discover prisoners down there.
Well, that's what you thought first.
Right. And that's in the movie, people being used as food. It's horrifying. But finding the gold and putting it back because it's really valueless in a post-apocalyptic world, you're right, I don't think that was in the film.
Right, and to me, that's when I started thinking, you can prep, and you're prepping for the best case. But in the worst case, even gold and silver isn't going to save you.
Right.
You know, it's canned, non-perishable forms of food,
Right.
propane, and lead.
Yeah, yeah.
They had a gun.
Yeah,
Somehow they had a gun with
right.
them.
But to your point, man, in a post-apocalyptic world like that, most of us will probably wish we'd been taken out by the first strike. I'd rather live in the afterlife than live in that bleak despair that is described in The Road, because even if you have guns and bullets and food and water, it's a hellish life as depicted in that movie. But let's leave people with a bright spot, because what we've just described is the absolute worst case scenario. Let's be optimistic and assume it will never get that bad. When I did my micro documentary, The Silver Perspective, back in, I think it was 2010, Dave, the price for silver was $21, and according to John Williams from shadowstats.com, the all-time inflation-adjusted high for silver was $138. Flash forward to today, 2015, silver's at $14, and according to John Williams at ShadowStats, because of all the Fed shenanigans and money printing, the current all-time high, inflation-adjusted high for silver now is $601. So it's just stunning to me that people can go out and get some measure of protection in the form of physical silver for $14.
It's incredible. The precious metals are just, they're by far the best value investment I've ever seen in 30 years of doing investments and following the stock market and participating in just about every aspect of finance. However, and actually the mining stocks are even cheaper. So, I mean, I guess the point here is, if you know, you have to prepare for the best case. And I guess in terms of a possible bright spot for derailing the potential for all-out nuclear war, I started thinking just in the last few days that it's also very possible that we could see ultimately a coup of our government, and it would come from inside, probably military generals who are completely disgusted with what's going on. Now, Obama's fired most of the dissenting military generals, but I was having a conversation with a friend and a colleague yesterday who knows some retired military generals. One of them is a 2-star general who lives next door to him, and he said these guys all hate the U.S. government and they hate what's going on. And so you could eventually see a coup, and that wouldn't be unprecedented in history. I mean, I think it's a little bit of a long shot at this point. But, you know, either way, in order to prep for the better outcome of what we've been talking about, you have to do all these things that are kind of textbook prepping, and it starts with buying gold and silver and buying it now, because the premiums are only going to get wider as we move forward.
Yeah. Well, Dave, thanks, man. I really do appreciate your time. You've been very generous with your time today. Can you please remind people where they can find you? Tell people how to get to your awesome website, will you?
Yes, it's investmentresearchdynamics.com, and I try to put out daily commentary on whatever topic is agitating me the most when I wake up. And I kind of specialize in putting out junior mining stock research and the housing industry, which I think is getting ready to fall off a cliff again. And I think the home builders I mean, you have to manage the position, but I think they make a great short sell opportunity right now, and it's a good way to add short side alpha to any kind of portfolio if people even still want to be involved in the stock market. But it's a highly leveraged way of shorting the stock market here, because we know eventually it's going to collapse. But it's investmentresearchdynamics.com. That's where you can find me.
Guys, our guest has been Dave Kranzler from Investment Research Dynamics. And Dave, again, thanks so much for your time.
Thanks for having me back on, Sean. I always love chatting with you.
Oh, thank you, sir. And guys, thank you so much for your support at sgtreport.com. Do check us out at thephaser.com as well, where I handpick videos and stories on a daily basis for you to see and read. And also at thelibertymill.com. Real news 24/7. Thanks, guys. Thanks, Dave.
Hey, thank you.
All right, man. God bless.
All right, likewise, Sean. I'll speak to you soon.
All right. Talk to you later. Bye.